really hard time answering this specific question, where I want to say, I forgot what the question was, but the answer essentially was a group of Asian folks. I don't know if it was South Koreans or what, but he asked, what type of people, are these, to kind of prompt folks to answer. And, being in the history class to where, there's so many facts, there's so many things, cultural values that you can attach to a culture, not just a type of people, but a culture, and to use, a gesture or a physical feature was something that, was pretty hurtful. And as somebody in that class, as a student that was just trying to learn, just trying to take in the information and do the best that I can, it's something that really impacted my confidence in the short term, in the immediate setting. In the long term, I look back at just, even to this day, it resonates with me, because I hate to blame that teacher and say that that's why I didn't do well in that class. But I know that it took my mind away from the fact that I was present to get an education, to learn, to get a good grade. I think for the remainder of my time in that class, I just wanted to get in and get out and pass. Of course, I didn't want to fail the class, but I think the rest of my time, in that class was just wanting to escape. And looking back, I think that's one of those things that I regret, because, GPAs and things like that, they matter when later on down the line, when you're trying to apply for grants and whatnot for college and whatnot, like, these grades do matter. But it's just one of those things where I look back and I think about how, wow, like, that little incident potentially could have impacted, like, the effort I put in. And I hate to blame it, because there's things that I could have done probably to do better in that class. But I just remember, like, stepping foot in that class, there was more. It wasn't just about learning anymore. It's just about hoping today that something embarrassing doesn't happen, or that I don't have to be kind of singled out, I guess.
Hi, my name is James Ward. I'm from the Visalia Times Delta and Tulare Advanced Register, and today we are holding a forum on systematic racism in Tulare County and how that affects people of color and in the entire society. We're going to, the forum is going to be will hopefully very conversational and free-flowing, but what I wanted to do to start is have Professor Lopez kind of set the table for us and really define for us what systemic racism is. So, Dr. Lopez, the floor is yours, and just kind of go over what systemic racism is.
First, I just want to thank you, the Times Delta, and the many others who contributed to this forum, and just this important, much needed discussion. And I want to thank David Salih for courageously sharing his story with us as well. Just quickly, my name is Patricia Lopez. I'm assistant professor in the Kremen School of Education at Fresno State. I'm also the daughter of Abel Corralejo Lopez Sr. and Evelynina Palomino. I'd like to acknowledge my grandmother, Amelia Palomino, who I believe is also listening in this evening. I always feel it's important for us to humanize ourselves when we speak. And I think in the spirit of, situating our discussion, I want to first just begin by thanking all of you who are here this evening. I'm sure a lot of folks, ourselves included, had a long work day. To be here this evening to engage in a complex discussion like this, it's very layered, it's commendable. So thank you. My colleague, Dr. Raymar Henderson, who's here as well this evening, and we spent a lot of time thinking about how to engage in a thoughtful and authentic discussion on systemic racism here in Tulare County. As educators and social science researchers, we really started to look and analyze the discourse, or like the public discussions and the terms that people were using when discussing racism here in Tulare County, and particularly media commentary, because I imagine many of us here read through. We're part of the readership of the Times Delta, and for us, we really did notice a number of patterns, and one of the patterns that certainly stood out was just this omission of acknowledging racism as a system. And so rather what we noticed were that these, contributions and discussions were being had were really reducing racism to these just individual acts, which we of course know this is not the case. And so with that, we felt it was important to put
We might have.
I believe. Okay, yeah, we can get that over to you. Sorry, Jim, we got cut off. But we just felt it was important, to begin moving towards just a shared understanding, right? Which is a hugely important first step when you're confronting such a complex topic like systemic racism. And in our piece, we do explain, and I think it's important even today to, as we go into the discussion, systemic racism, what we also refer to as structural racism, right? Institutional racism is the normalization and legitimization of historical, cultural, institutional, interpersonal dynamics that routinely advantage whites at the same time while producing cumulative racism is a very sophisticated system, and these cumulative and chronic adverse experiences, they manifest in things like laws and policies, formal and informal rules. I'm sorry, am I breaking up, Jim?
You are breaking up on occasion.
Okay, my apologies. The internet world.
Right.
But what we really want to make sure that as we embark on this journey and this discussion is that we're very clear that that systemic racism is a system, right? And it's very much embedded in our institutions. It's embedded in our economic system, in our cultural and societal norms. And this system of structural racism, it's affected and it continues to impact communities of color. We reference and we mentioned the issue of red segregation. Our set of by tangible examples of the segregation. And we still see these things today. We see it in the explicit data on mass incarcerations, on police violence, the accessibility or lack of accessibility to preventative and consistent medical care, basic things, right? What should be basic rights. And so these realities are very historical. They've certainly been here, and I applaud Jim and many others who really contributed to helping us to recall some of that history. And they've become more and more sophisticated as our institutions, right, as our education system, our healthcare, our housing, our government, our public safety systems have become much more substantive. Rely on racist ideologies and assumptions about people of color, and most notably by individuals who hold positions of power. And so these realities have consequences for people of color, and that's a very important aspect that I think we really do need to spend time talking about. So with that, I'm with Dr. Henderson. He's going to share a little bit more just about that issue of impact and psychological well-being. Hand it to you now.
Yeah, Dr. Henderson, why don't you kind of set the table for us too, and talk about systemic racism and what that might mean to an individual. How does an individual navigate the world that is affected by systemic racism?
Absolutely. Thank you, Jim. And also thank you, Dr. Lopez. I really appreciate the space. For those who are under the sound of my voice, I know it's dinner time. I know for some it may be sleeping time. Now is the time to have discussion on racism and how it impacts individuals on an interpersonal level. So first, I want to start off by saying most folks encounters with systemic racism. Systemic racism is not a ghost, right? It's not this creature that is out there in the air that we can't see, right? It's not someone just, hey, I just ran into systemic racism today. That's not what it is. Systemic racism is that it is a system. And most folks, when we talk about racism, it is they're under the impression that these are the folks who are burning crosses in one's yard. Now, the story about David was so gripping. I don't know about everybody else, but I saw the pain in his eyes. David, if you're out there, I appreciate you for sharing this story. And the things about David is racism will have you questioning your own psyche, right? And so David when he was speaking to his lived experiences, he was questioning his own experiences. Well, maybe it's me, right? And that's the thing about systemic racism. Systemic racism will have us chasing our own shadow and kind of blaming ourselves for, these systems, these things that are in place. One thing I want to talk about specifically is the amount of suspensions that are happening in the Central Valley, right? So when we think about this thing called racialized stress, I'm gonna kind of unpack what that means. And the way I'm gonna unpack it is I want everybody to think about, working out, anything ranging from going for a walk to doing yoga. And imagine going for that walk or doing yoga. I'm hearing a little feedback. Is it?
No, you're coming in clear for me. So go ahead.
Okay. So imagine doing that exercise with, let's just say, a 20-pound weight vest on, right? And the thing is, when you finish the workout, you can take that off. Unfortunately, for folks of color, that is something that they have to live with. So imagine walking around with a 20-pound weight vest on for your whole life, right? So not only the physical stress that happens, but the psychological and the spiritual stress, right? The emotional stress, right? So you have a lot of these things that happen that impact the body. For example, imagine what it looks like for your father and or mother not to be able to get a banking loan, right? And the only thing that your parents desire to do is to pave the way for you, the next generation. So all these things kind of impact. So racialized stress is one of those. And when we think about how it may impact our interpersonal relationships, we may want to isolate, right? Because you know what? I'm the problem. And that's the way systemic racism works. David thought that he was the problem. No, he was an outcome of a greater system at play, right? We see it today, with COVID-19 and the impact on Asian communities, just things that we've seen in the news, right? We have communities of folk terrorized, right? Terrorized here in America. So when we think about racialized stress, and when we think about the impact of racism on the psyche, that's just one way to think about it. And before I leave, I want y'all to think about the image of walking around with the weight vest on, doing everything in your day-to-day, right? Whether you're going into the bank, whether you're going in to purchase a car, whether you're walking in the grocery store, so forth and so on, right? And when we think about, oh my God, is it me? I just drove by the police station, or the police just got behind me, and I know I don't look the right. I know I don't have the color for the connection. So I want us to think about some of those things, as other folks are speaking. Thank you.
I believe you're muted, James.
Professor Villegas, I wanted to ask you about your experiences teaching at COS and how you might see how systemic racism affects your students, specifically your students, because you have boots on the ground in Tulare County, and you might have a unique outlook on this.
Absolutely. Thank you so much. And thank you again to the Times Delta and you for this invitation. Thank you, Dr. Lopez, Dr. Anderson, and Margot for being a part of this conversation. I have the pleasure of joining College of the Sequoias this year as a professor in the political science department. And the conversations that we've had online, as a part of the COVID-19 pandemic, as part of all the ongoing events towards racial justice that we saw over the summer, and many of the unfortunate tragedies that we've witnessed, I've seen my students impacted firsthand in the way they respond, in their emails, in their communications, and more specifically, in the way that systematic racism really affects them in their day-to-day lives here in Tulare County, right? And I want to start by also acknowledging something that Dr. Henderson brought up, right? It's the fact that many of these students start to question themselves, right? Start to question whether it's something that they're not doing or something that some deficit that they have, right? Because we've become accustomed to this sort of deficit mindset when it comes to education. And I want to quote MLK here, right? When people start to throw out this rhetoric of, well, maybe this individual should pull themselves up by their bootstraps. He said it's a cruel jest to say to a bootless man that he ought to lift himself up by his own bootstraps, right? And so we have to think about the ways that our students are affected. I have students who have been personally affected by the COVID-19 pandemic, where their family members are hospitalized or sadly have passed away, and it's up to them in order to step up and take on caregiving roles within their family, or to navigate paperwork for family members who might be undocumented. And sadly, I have students come to me asking me and saying, well, I can provide a note, I swear I'm not lying. And it's never my assumption that a student would lie about that, right? My policy, for example, has always been to take students at their words, because one of the very clear ways that we see systematic racism embed itself within our county is in the disproportionate impact and the lack of health insurance that many of our communities don't have, right? And so I would never ask a student for a doctor's note knowing that many students lack health insurance, or their families lack health insurance to even go to the doctor, right? Or might even fear going to the doctor for fear of their undocumented status. Unfortunately, we've also seen the disproportionate impact of implicit bias within our healthcare system, in which women and women of color are often not believed, right, when they're expressing their levels of pain or the fact that they need medicine. And so this is just a few of the ways, to give you an example of the ways my students have been disproportionately affected. Today, we're discussing civil rights, right? And so I'm teaching my students about the history of the civil rights movement, not only from the perspective of leaders like MLK, right, but Malcolm X, Fred Hampton, young people who try to advocate for change in their communities. I tell them about the stories of Dolores Huerta, Larry Itliong, other API folks who led movements to, challenge systemic racism in our agricultural sector, right? And there's a rich history there that isn't always taught to our students. And so one thing I want to emphasize is that though we also do have, a lot of problems to address within Tulare County, within the Central Valley broadly, we also have a movement of people who have been fighting to try and address systemic racism for years. And it's a battle that is a long arc towards justice, but I do believe that our students and our future leaders have the potential to create change for the better.
Thank you, Professor Villegas. Margot, I wanted to ask you about how systemic racism really affects people on a day-to-day basis when they're, living their lives, going shopping, raising a family, trying to make a living. How is this systemic? How does systemic racism affect someone's psychological and really health and their well-being as they kind of navigate this world?
Thank you. Yes, first I'd like to thank Visalia Times Delta to be a part of this 5-point series. I think it takes a lot of courage to have this conversation. my hope is that this conversation is going to create deeper bonds and human connections. This is a charged topic because I think it really triggers the roots or the core of our sadness, which is our sense of belonging. And I think when people come in to me or they call and they make appointments to talk about their stress, their hypertension, their rapid heart rate, right? Chronic illnesses. I think when we get to the core of sort of what's perpetuating their suffering, it's that sense of belonging. And when we can track it, it's people of color tend to, like Dr. Henderson was talking about, carry this additional weight, this emotional weight within their psyche that causes us to believe the lies we tell ourselves, which is we're not worthy, we're not good enough, we don't belong. And I think that is at the core of feeling the racial disparities and the unfair differences within the system, which is clearly systemic racism. How are we constantly trying to fit in to a system that really begins to view us as invisible? We begin to believe that we are invisible and everything seems much more harder, which impacts us psychologically. But the psychological turns into organic, which is the physical world, the heart problems, the chronic illnesses, the depression. And so how this impacts, it impacts many layers of a person. And I would say the core root is it really begins, it causes us to question who we are as a person. And I think that oftentimes, I think living and being raised, I was born in Visalia and raised in Goshen, and my mom still lives there with her husband. There's huge disparities. There's huge differences. And actively not knowing seems to be, which is another word for ignorance, seems to be what a lot of people in Tulare County wrap themselves around. It's sort of like, I'd rather not know. I'd rather not see you. Do what you're, it's really hard for people of color to really move up, to shift, to make change, especially when they're plagued with their own inner lies or the lies that they tell themselves because they've had this oppression over them. And I guess to answer your question is it impacts them not only psychologically, but physiologically. We know that that it increases, to not feel that sense of belonging increases stress, which is correlated to it. It's very much linked to depression and hypertension and all these other issues, health issues. So I think this is a very deep rooted issue. And I'm glad we're able to have this conversation so that we can bring it up to people's consciousness.
Yeah, thank you very much, Margot. I wanted to ask this question specifically of Dr. Lopez, but then after she answers the question, I want kind of open it up to everyone in the discussion. What I've seen from letters to the editor and comments on Facebook and readers who call me on the phone when we've covered these issues like Black Lives Matter or racism in Tulare County, and many people say that systematic racism in Tulare County does not exist. And I wanted, as a native of Tulare County, Dr. Lopez, someone who grew up here in Visalia, in Tulare County, I wanted you to kind of address that issue, and then everyone else could talk about that too, about people who deny the existence of systemic racism.
Yeah, I mean, I think Margot put it well, right? You, if you don't have to you just resort to acting as though it's not there, right? I mean, it's that internalized. And I'm even just looking at the comments. I think that folks even in the comments are actually speaking to this. You know, it is, so how do you, especially if you look at, you know, Tulare County, and you do see a large portion of, you know, people of color, right? It is so here you are enduring it at one end, and when you have the luxury or privilege of not having to confront it, right? That's how sophisticated the structural racism is that when it, you know, it's actually just constantly operating. So it actually could even convince you, right? It could even convince you that that it's just not that bad, and because it's not as bad for you, right? So it's very easy to want to deflect in that way, and it's also, you know, it's some people just we see that in the class. You know, Professor Vega spoke to that. I mean, you literally will have individuals who know what they feel, they know what they see, and just having that language, right? There's just there's so much there to unpack, and you know that is a stress factor. Heck, I'm gonna be honest, I'm stressed out right now, you know. And if there are moments when you can step away, you know, that's just how um, is that great, but um, you know, it's not unique to Tulare County. I think, you know, major issue is that sometimes we can get stuck into this rut. And I know that it's put onto the Central Valley. As somebody who's had the luxury of living in many different places, there is also this, you know, perception that it's that, oh, that's what, you know, that's a Central Valley thing. No, this stuff it's everywhere. And I think that many people could ignore the fact, or think that these symbolic, you know, beautification looks more beautiful, sophisticated, participating, right, in a very kind of, you know, there's just a lot there to unpack, and I do in the Sun Valley where we are increasingly that issue of internalized oppression, internalized racism, and how it manifests is it's there as well. And so I'll pass.
Open this conversation to anyone else who want to talk about people who deny the existence of systematic racism in Tulare County and in the United States in general. Dr. Henderson, would you like to kind of chime in on this topic?
Absolutely, Jim. Thank you, Dr. Lopez. The way that I think about racism, and to the folks who think that it doesn't exist, I would ask them a question. Just because racism is like oxygen, right? It's like the wind, and like the wind is not blowing all the time, but you're constantly breathing, correct? And so the juxtaposition is that folks of color need air too, right? And we're not getting it. Rest in peace to Eric Garner, right? So when we think about racism, right? Racism is so sophisticated that it's even the majority, right? The numerical majority, i.e., white folks, have played into the narrative that it does not exist, right? Therefore, there's no language to put to it, which is why I led with, you know, racism can be perceived as the proverbial boogeyman, right? So if I go on the internet right now and look for pictures of the boogeyman, I won't necessarily find an actual face to go with the boogeyman, right? And racism is not a boogeyman. Racism is a very sophisticated system, right? With faces and places. And the unfortunate thing is that when folks think that it doesn't exist, we are able to disconnect from the pain, like what David shared, right? So in preparing for today, and I read an article about El Diamante High School, right? And at El Diamante High School, right, you had to take down your Black Lives Matter signs. So imagine Jim, right? Imagine Margot, imagine Dr. Lopez, imagine not seeing Dr. Henderson. Well, we'll take the doctor off because when you see me in the streets, you don't know I'm a doctor. So imagine not seeing Ray Marr, a 6'2" black man, right? With a bag of Skittles and some tea like Trayvon Martin. My life can end right there because I'm a threat, right? And so when we think about racism, racism is very much real, right? And folks of color have been carrying the weight, right? Dr. Lopez spoke about her father, right? And also a Visalia native, right? Essentially, right, grinding against racism. And that's the thing. You know, I want to say this, and then I definitely want to hear my colleagues speak. When Martin Luther King was assassinated, right? He was in his late 30s. When the coroner opened his body, they said he had the insides of a 60-year-old man. Tell me that racism doesn't exist.
Thank you, Dr. Henderson. I think you put that very beautifully. And you know, I think the timing of this conversation is so perfect. Just yesterday was the anniversary of the assassination of Malcolm X, right? And to answer your question, right, what do we tell people who say systemic racism doesn't exist, or, you know, it might have existed back then, but it's not existing today in Tulare County? I think I want to quote Malcolm X here, right? You know, and he said when talking to a reporter, if you stick a knife in my back 9 inches and pull it out 6 inches, there's no progress. If you pull it all the way out, that's not progress. Progress is the healing of the wound that the blow made. And they haven't even pulled the knife out, much less heal the wound. They won't even admit the knife is there, right? And even today, we continue to witness disproportionate health disparities, vast economic inequalities, and a justice system that continues to exploit, to disproportionately target people of color, right? And, you know, for those non-believers, there's research out there that shows that, you know, white people and Black people use drugs at the same rates, at very similar rates. And yet Black people are 2.7 times as likely to be arrested for drug-related crimes, right? That's a very point-blank example of systemic racism, right? When we talk about young people of color who attend public schools who aren't as well-funded and don't offer, you know, as many AP courses or honors courses, those same students have to compete with students in wealthier schools who are able to achieve higher GPAs because they offer more AP classes, more honors classes, more extracurriculars, et cetera. And so, you know, like Dr. Henderson very clearly stated, it's not that we're going to see systematic racism just walking down the street and saying hello to us, but we can very clearly see the way that systematic racism permeates almost every aspect of our everyday lives, right? When we get back to other issues in Tulare County and we look at, you know, the COVID-19 vaccination rates, how is it that people of color are not being vaccinated at the same rate, right? And there's a long history of people of color being exploited, right, through the Tuskegee tragedy and experiments, right, where Africans were targeted. But yet we see that we don't have the same sort of investment and resources into communities of color and low-income communities to help dismantle systematic racism at a county level, at a statewide level. And so these are all things that we should be paying attention to as we go about our day-to-day lives.
So, since this is a charged topic, when somebody of color is told that systemic racism doesn't exist in Tulare County, I think suffering is perpetuated through creating categories of superiority and inferiority. I think we're tired. It's sort of like this emotional exhaustion. People are exhausted to broker a dialogue regarding does systemic racism exist, or racism for that matter. It's charged because when you are discriminated against, there's so much suffering. There's history of suffering. And to be discounted and to say that it doesn't exist means that our truths don't exist. It's such a deeper. I think that when we talk about racism, that there is a lot of pain involved, a lot of fear, because when you can ignore it, when you can believe that it doesn't exist, you're not in discomfort. You are not suffering. When we suffer, we gain wisdom. And we have to suffer in order to learn, in order to make changes. And I think that it's challenging for people who don't want to feel discomfort to even acknowledge the suffering of others. I say dare to be human, dare to have a conversation, because in the end, when you're able to have a conversation, when you're able to sit in a space and to listen and to be curious and to ask questions, I think that there's enlightenment. The rewards are so much greater than the anger and the sadness and the hatred you carry when you decide to ignore the existence. I always say that if somebody's going to deny it, that's okay. You can deny it, but it still exists. And when you dare to listen, when you have the tolerance for suffering, then I'll tell you my story. So.
Yeah, no, that's some interesting. Plus, what and there's the other side of the coin where people accept that systemic racism did exist in Tulare County, but they say things have changed for the better. But let's go back and let's kind of address whether systemic racism. Let's not even address whether systemic racism is still a problem in Tulare County. How does Tulare County's historic systemic racism affect current society? And I'm thinking about the case that Dr. Lopez and Dr. Henderson wrote about, the Weisinger case, where African American children were not allowed to get education in Visalia, and it all went away to the Supreme Court. A story I worked on a few years ago about the KKK, the Ku Klux Klan's long history in Tulare County, going back, many years. So why don't I'll start with Dr. Henderson about this, but everyone will get a chance to talk. Let's just talk about how the history of systemic racism affects people today, even if you say, let's say that systemic racism doesn't exist today, which I think is inaccurate. But if you say, okay, it did exist, how is it affecting people today? Because history affects people. So, Dr. Henderson, why don't you talk about kind of the lasting effects of systemic racism and how it affects people today?
Jim, I thank you again, and I really enjoy listening to my panel members. So I talked about El Diamante High School. I'm going to share some other stats, because I'm looking in the comments, and Jim says, how does it affect today, right? So Jim, if I didn't have a healthy racial identity, meaning that if I don't understand that Black is beautiful, I might, after this panel, go play in traffic, because some of these comments are inflammatory, to say the least, right? So again, in preparing for the lecture today, I was looking at some of the ACLU data, right? And the data spoke to how the Visalia School District looked the other way when Black students were encountering racism, right? And so think about these young minds. So think about the young mind. So I'm gonna take one step back, Jim. So if as a young person I got into a car accident, right? I know that I may have a hard time getting into the car and driving to see any destination that I want to see, right? Now imagine having multiple car accidents, trauma, right, that these young Black students are experiencing as high schoolers. Right? Young minds that are not yet formed, their racial identity is not yet complete, which is fluid, by the way. And so when we think about all these different things, right, these young Black folk, right, these young Asian folk, right, these young Latino and Latino folk, right, are having these lived experiences. So again, imagine how you feel, or how it feels not to be seen, right? So there's a lot of discourse about Tulare County. Right? It's impossible to understand American history without understanding who contributed to American history. This is not just the Pilgrims and Indians who came over here and had a discourse and they had some tension, and now we have this thing called America, right? Absolutely not. When we drive through the Central Valley, when we drive through Visalia, it's right here in our face, right? In the so-called state where everybody drinks Jamba Juice and goes surfing on their lunch break, right? And so you have folks really kind of thinking about some of these lived experiences of folk, right? These students, David, right? The pain in David's eyes. David could very well have the cure for HIV/AIDS in his head, but you know what? He decided not to go to med school because of his experiences in high school. So there's no way that anyone can tell me that systemic racism is not impacting these young folk yesterday, today, and tomorrow if we don't do anything about it. Thank you.
Dr. Lopez, how does how is the legacy of Weisinger and the KKK in the early part of this century and all the way up into the 1980s when they tried to make the KKK the headquarters right here in Visalia? How is that affecting people today? Or do you think it is affecting people today? I will not presume to know your answer.
Yeah, I mean, I think Dr. Henderson said it well in the beginning. You could, you can remove the white gowns, you can remove the caps, but it doesn't mean that you've removed the ideology, right? The perception, and I think that's very much alive, right? You still walk into many of our schools and you see, just the complete disregard for, young people's cultures, their histories, their languages, right? I mean, that's still something that we're contending with, right? In fact, we're criminalizing, right? I know that we think that just because we're not doing these very physical kind of acts, or we're not placing students on two different campuses, that these things still aren't occurring, right? We're just doing them. They're very emotional now, right? They're very they're very overt just as much as, and covert. I think back about how this idea that we started to have schools within schools, right? So even when we began integration, right, in this area, we had things like, programs, right? We had things like learning opportunity. We still see, and even that reference that Dr. Henderson was mentioning in that article in the ACLU case was explicitly showing young people who have been conveniently removed from traditional, like, comprehensive high schools and put into continuation high schools, right? We are removing young people, and those are the people who stay in the system, right? We call them survivors. There are so many others that are pushed completely out of the system. We see this in, young people in our incarceration rates, right? We're literally criminalizing, we're policing our schools. What are we telling young people when they walk into a school context and they are policed, right? They're policed on the streets. They walk into their school context. And so, I think that these sentiments are very much alive, and I think that people rationalize them, right? People really do rationalize and claim that we need that because, these kids are just that unruly, right? And so I think that, if you were to step into every year, I think about my, I teach future teachers, and I have them shadow a student, and I'm amazed. These are young people themselves who haven't been out of high school for typically more than like 5-6 years. And I'm having them go and literally shadow a young high school student. And the things that they come back telling me is just profound. They just see the oppression that young people are experiencing. So it's very much alive. I think education is, one of many institutions that it's just manifested its ugly face. Young people, they would tell you many stories about their experiences. So I'll pass it on.
Yeah, Professor Villegas, history. I mean, how does history affect today, especially in Tulare County?
Absolutely. And I was just speaking to my students about this today, right? When we think about historical things that have happened in US history, like the New Deal, which were supposed to extend labor rights and extend all of these, great privileges to US workers, we have to think about who was left out, right? And specifically, agricultural workers, domestic workers were exempted from these New Deal legislations, right? And why is that? And it's because people of color were working these jobs, right? It's because FDR made compromises to appease Southerners at the time, Southern segregationists, and these are policies that still affect us to this very day, right? California just barely passed farm worker overtime within the past couple of years, right? And that's something that still won't go fully into effect, I believe, until 2022 or 2023. So when we look at the exploitation of workers, when we look at the historic participation of people of color across California, across the Central Valley, across Tulare, we have to think about how communities were redlined, right? And I want to thank Dr. Lopez for specifically bringing up, systematic racism within education. I just to share a little bit about myself personally, I grew up in Kern County, right? And when I attended high school, our high schools had 7 times the national suspension and expulsion rate. And eventually the district was sued. The Kern High School District was sued for disproportionately suspending and expelling young brown and black men of color, right? I had classmates getting kicked out for wearing a hat in class, for chewing gum, for speaking back to a teacher, right? And we have to think about how this fuels this larger system of the school to prison pipeline, in which these students that are suspended and expelled end up on track to our prison system. And so we have to think about, how do we address this moving forward? Why is it that we have invested so much into incarceration and so little into education, right, over the past 30 or so several years? And so we have to think about how systemic racism, still has those lasting effects today, particularly within our own educational institutions, and how we can do better. Right now, I love that the Visalia Times Delta has, opened up space for this critical conversation, and has also opened up space for a broader conversation around ethnic studies in our schools, right? Why is it that we haven't invested the resources into funding ethnic studies at every single one of our high schools? And how are we examining the ways that our school districts are spending their budgets, right? A lot of our Central Valley schools get tons of money from the state because we're funded through a LCFF program, right? Local control funding formula. I won't get into super details, right? But essentially, we fund students who we're supposed to be targeting: foster students, low-income students, students who are struggling. And yet sometimes school districts have not used this properly, right? Fresno Unified School District, I believe, used this on surveillance and policing equipment, right? Which only further contributes to the systematic racism of surveilling students of color, punishing students of color, rather than providing them the systems, the resources that they need, like counselors, access to classes, access to extra tutoring, and resources that they need to succeed. So it's something to keep in mind. And I'm so glad that this conversation is going to be continued, focusing more specifically on education and healthcare and these other fields, because there's just so much to talk about here.
Margot, would you like to talk about how past events affect today's, especially on a personal basis, on how things in history can affect you today?
Great. I think we learn from our history. And I think what we've learned is that there has been a system of disparities. There has been actively not wanting to acknowledge the suffering and the disparities. I think Black Lives Matters is a very good representation of when people's sense of belonging and responsibility has been shaken. And I think the people who are comfortable, who don't suffer, who don't feel the racist and the ongoing disparity, I think that they become angry, because it really causes people to question what they've been doing and who they are. It questions not only just their identity, but them spiritually. And so I think that it's a really honest representation of how we've allowed, our system has allowed this to happen for such a long time. When I worked for the juvenile hall system, I had group, and I often told the boys, I said, raise your hand if you're white. And nobody would raise their hands because there was no white boys in the system. at that time. I said, raise your hands if you're Mexican or Hispanic. I would say 99.9% raise their hands. And I said, raise your hand if you're African American. We had one. I said, there's something wrong with this picture, right? And this is constant. This happens just down the street. I mean, this is happening right now. And I think that how they captured and how they created the system of racism is that they would tell the boys, a lawyer would basically say, or somebody would tell them, hey, if you say that you're part of a gang, we'll let you go right away and you can go home with your mom. And they say, yeah, I'm gonna be part of a gang. And then they would pick them up a few days later because they're wearing the wrong color, because their family members were part of a gang. And then they're in the system and they don't get out of the system. It's really, really hard to get out of the system. I was absolutely angered by how the system continues to work against us. And so I think now more than ever, we have to have these conversations. And if people don't have the tolerance and the maturity to suffer and to dare to listen, that's okay, because we're still going to be having these conversations, hopefully over and over again. And I think that everything matters. It takes 2 or 3 generations before there's change. And so we have to be able to educate, to talk about, and to be able to have conversations that really allow us the curiosity to learn and to have that change. So what I would say is that I think history does teach us, and I think that we're learning, and this is why we're here.
I'm going to throw this next question out to anyone in the room, and just virtually raise your hand or get my attention to see who wants to go first with this one. But can you point to current examples of how systemic racism is affecting people of color in Tulare County? And I'm just looking at the room, and whoever wants to go first can. Let's go with. I'll put you on the spot, Professor Villegas. Well, why don't you go first and talk about how systemic racism is affecting people of color today in Tulare County?
Absolutely. And, I want to credit one of my colleagues, Benny Corona, who I saw in the chat and the comments, who brought this up. But I think if we look to immigration and the way workers are treated right now, currently in our system, we see systematic racism right in our faces, right? The fact that we have these essential workers who have continued to put their lives on the line all throughout the past few months to literally feed the world. And yet we still don't afford them livable wages. We still don't afford them a path to citizenship, right? And a humane, just immigration reform. That is, systematic racism. And one of the ways we can see systematic racism just permeate itself, today. And it's one of the biggest issues, I think, that disenfranchises people across the country. It also affects the participation of those children, right? Many of them who are US born citizens themselves. We have mixed status families who are constantly fearing whether, ICE is going to show up at the door, whether, their family is going to be torn apart at any moment. And that in itself is systematic racism, which doesn't allow people to succeed and to reach their full potential.
Dr. Henderson, why don't you go next with the same question?
Jim, just so I'm accurate and succinct, may you repeat the question for me one more time, please?
Sure, yes. Can you point to current examples of how systematic racism is affecting people of color in Tulare County?
Well, Jim, I want to go back to what I spoke to earlier at El Diamante High School, the ACLU, and also I was reading about, I guess a church who called, or the code enforcement that was called to take signs down. And so we've spoken a lot today. I don't know if it actually has come up like this, is that folks are being silenced, right? And so for my counselors, just for folk, when you don't have language to put to your lived experiences, it impacts your psyche. It impacts every realm of your existence. And what we're seeing now in Tulare County is that folks' right to put language to their lived experiences is being silenced. And so when we think about that, and when we think about how that happens generation upon generation upon generation, then we have what's called generational pain that is passed down from generation to generation and generation. And unfortunately, that pain goes somewhere, right? And so when we think about that, and then we blame folks because they have a civil uprising, or because, now I'm not advocating that folks destroy the neighborhood. On the other hand, when we really get down to the nuts and bolts of it, these are the voices of the unheard, right? You're going to have some opportunists out there. On the other hand, you're going to have some folks that say, hey, they're crying for help. They're crying for help, no tissue, no way to feel healed, no way to feel complete and reduce the pain. So when I think about how it looks and what it looks like present day, that's the part that hurts me, right? Because when I look at these statistics, another statistic, I want to say the Central Valley is in the top 5, or for sure the top 10 counties where suspension rates of folks of color are much higher for students of color. And folks maybe not be familiar with, there's this thing called school to prison pipeline, right? So those trajectories are being impacted, right? So kids are systematically being funneled into the correction system. Now, Jim, I'll say this thing, and I'll go ahead and let you get to somebody else. If I were to walk into 3rd, 4th, 5th, 6th grade classroom and say, "Hey, how's everybody doing today? Everybody, hey, I'm doing good. Let me ask y'all a question. Who wants to go to prison? How many hands do you think are going to go up?" Right? And the systematic taking away of choices, that is what is so angry, right? These choices are systematically being taken away from our Black, our brown, and our yellow folk, right? And folks it's not registering folks' mind. Nobody's going to raise their hand and say, "Hey, that sounds like an amazing field trip. Let me sign up to go to jail." Thank you.
For sure. Dr. Lopez, would you like to address that question?
One of the things I think that comes to mind, and I know we're almost at time, so I want to give Margot a chance, is I think just your recent reporting of the access to COVID vaccines, right? We just reported, and we had a quick exchange, Jim. So you have upwards of 60 is Latino communities, although access to COVID vaccines is less than 1/3 of all vaccines that's been distributed. And if you back into that data and you back yourself up, it's actually a portrait that's a complete artifact of systemic racism, right? We know that at most, probably only 1/3 of the actual Latino community has access to healthcare, right? Has access to, that service. And so when we look at that COVID vaccination access, it's almost a portrait of who's really truly of that demographic getting access to Medicare, right? To medical services. The comment about our essential workers, our farm workers, the least likely to have access to medical services. And so I think that is that right there, that data point that you all recently published, is a complete artifact of systemic racism.
Oh.
Margot, go ahead and chime in on this topic.
Okay. We're talking about current systemic racism.
Yeah.
What we're talking.
Exactly. Can you point to a current example of how systemic racism is affecting people of color in Tulare County?
Yeah. So I would even bring it even much more specific. That this $600 check that everybody got wasn't given to any farm labor families. It was only given to people who had socials. Huge, huge issue. It angers me to even think about that. We gave our checks away to people who needed them. And because same with the food, they give free food out to different agencies, and the agency in Goshen, they get rotten food. And the better fruits and vegetables that are given to people are in Visalia. And so the people in Goshen, what do? They get rotten strawberries and rotten fruit. And, so it's here. We are feeling it. We are table to mouth, oftentimes. And mental health services, really non-existent. They can't afford co-payments, or they can't afford services, or people aren't accepting Medi-Cal. Places are shut down. Parents have to work. Kids are struggling with school and learning, and they're not being tested. And it goes on and on and on. I would say, we see it. I hear it. I see it. My mom lives in Goshen. She tells me about it. No streetlights, bad roads. It's really, really sad. It makes me angry. Kids are getting picked up. They're being thrown in juvenile hall, labeled, and they're stuck. And so we have to be able to talk about and to make small changes in each person so that we can start healing, so that we feel a sense of belonging, cultivating a sense of belonging. Especially, it starts with really sort of a conversation and curiosity, and these types of forums. So I'll hand the mic back.
No, thank you very much. That was very thoughtful. I wanted to open up the forum to questions from readers, and Chrissy Obang has been one of our reporters, has been kind of going through comments and questions on the internet, and has passed me on some to me that were good. And our first one is from a reader who is asking about affirmative action. Is the question verbatim is affirmative action are affirmative action policies systemic racism? Why or why not? And I'll just start with Dr. Lopez here and go around as as we started the broadcast. So, Dr. Lopez, systemic is affirmative action is it systemic racism?
Is affirmative action a form of systemic racism? Absolutely not. It is not. Wow. First of all, we've criminalized and we've made it unlawful, so we don't actually exercise it. Affirmative action, just for those who may not know, because I think it's important for us to know, it is the consideration of race among many other factors, right, including gender, and in making decisions, right, in making decisions, for instance, in how we admit people to higher education. We no longer use it. It's actually been outlawed in the state of California and criminalized. So, and it's not a form, it's actually a response to systemic racism. It actually acknowledges that systemic racism has occurred, it continues to occur, and that we need to, in fact, consider and think about how we move away from a system of discrimination. So to frame it, and it's very common, we do see individuals who do, I see a comment here, casting it as discrimination or reverse discrimination, and that's simply just not the case.
Jim, Thank you again for the highlight, Dr. Lopez. I appreciate what you said. And I appreciate whoever posed the question. You're not alone in thinking that potentially affirmative action could be a systemic racism. And that's the system that we're talking about, right? So, there will be a lot of folk that would, let me back up a little bit. Professor, and I apologize if I get the enunciation of the name incorrect, Viejas. He spoke to those systems in play, and he quoted Dr. King talking about pull yourself up by the bootstraps. And I find it interesting that when we try to enact a policy, because not everybody's wearing boots, right? So if we're just going to think metaphorically, we're just going to think clear, right? Not everybody's wearing boots. Some people wearing sandals. Some people don't have shoes at all, right? So how are you going to pull yourself up by the bootstraps when you don't have on no boots, right? You're walking through glass, you're walking on the asphalt, you're walking on some hot rocks, so forth. You might walk in some water, some mud, might have some gators in the mud, some jive crocodiles, like some of the folks that may be in the chat, so forth and so on. So we have a lot of things going on, right, where we're trying to have some policy in place, right, to create some form of equity, right? We're trying to create some form of equity. So when I really think about policy and about affirmative action in statistics, right? So this is not Dr. Henderson, right, a social scientist. Statistics shows that white women are the actual beneficiaries of affirmative action. So I find it kind of, I don't know if I'm laughing to stop from crying or I'm just laughing because it's funny, right? So when I think about affirmative action, right, white women actually benefit the most from affirmative action, right? And like Dr. Lopez said, when we think about affirmative action in these policies, it's formulaic. So a lot of things go into this formula to decide, to make a decision, all right? And so thank you again, Jim. I appreciate the spotlight.
Thank you, Dr. Henderson. And just to continue this a bit more, I appreciate that we're bringing up the history on this, right? Because affirmative action, right? There was a famous Supreme Court case, Bakke versus UC Regents. This white guy didn't get into med school twice, decided to sue, said racial quotas were unjust, and that was the beginning of the end of affirmative action, right? And so now universities and UCs have to take this huge holistic review as opposed to having steps to make it easier for students of color, low-income students to gain access to these universities, right? And I want us to not only think about the way systematic racism permeates itself in admissions, but let's think about our workforce, right? Do we have faculty members? Do we have educators? Do we have government representatives that are truly reflective of the communities that they serve, right? And that's one thing we have to take into consideration. Like I mentioned earlier, right? When we have students who are competing against one another in lower funded schools versus higher funded schools, and we can't take things like, this person went to a very underfunded high school and didn't have access to AP classes, and they could only get a 4.0 GPA compared to this student who could take tons of AP classes and was able to attain like a 4.7 GPA. How is that racial justice? How is that equitable? How is that fair for students, right? And so that's something that we have to think about. Affirmative action is not systematic racism. Affirmative action is a response to systematic racism and an attempt to remedy the historical injustices that have occurred throughout our society.
Margot, would you like to chime in on this topic?
Yeah, I can give a personal example.
Yeah, that'd be great.
Okay, being raised in Goshen, right, which is beautiful. I love Goshen. It took me, I've been in school since I was 19, and I got my master's when I was 37, because I didn't have a school counselor who told me about education or college. They signed me up for home ec and sewing. I know how to sew and I know how to cook, but it took me from 19, I've been in school all my life, from 19 to 37 to really figure out that, oh my gosh, I can get an education. I got a bachelor's degree and then a master's, but that is the difference, is that I have experienced this disparity and this discrimination, and I paid for it with my life. And so with time, and I think that I could have had a master's, I could have had earning potential a lot sooner than at 37 or 40 in my 40s. But I didn't know. And that is the problem. And that's what's going on now. So whenever somebody comes into therapy, children, I'm constantly telling them about school. Go to school, talk to your counselor. This was my ticket out of poverty. And so I think affirmative action is a response to this type of situation. And it's very, very unfair. And every time I think about that counselor who never talked to me about my potential, I'm angered by it. So that's my take on affirmative action. It's a response to these types of situations.
I think this is an interesting question. A reader asks the connection between systemic racism and class or economic status. So, can someone let's go with the same technique. Well, let's go with Dr. Lopez first. Can we talk a little bit about class and what someone's economic status has to say about systematic racism?
I mean, yeah, I think that what we're seeing today, I think that's why it was racism is from the inception of capitalism, even locally here, when we think about just the exploitation of the Chinese during the railroad, and then even now, more full circle, the issue of race and economics are very much intertwined, and we actually can't even separate them at this point. And we even have folks who are explicitly using terms like racial capitalism, right? When we're really essentially looking at the depth of our economic system, and you see them intertwined, definitely for sure in the Central Valley. I just lost a thought because I actually had another data point that I wanted to reference. I'm going to hand it over, and if it comes back to me.
Okay, let us know. We'll put you back. Dr. Henderson, why don't you talk about the connection between class and racism?
You're muted, Dr. Henderson.
See, I got so excited, Jim. I was talking and didn't realize I was muted. So when I think about the connection, right? So there is a connection. So there's a such thing as taxes, right? We all pay taxes, right? So when we think about the connection between economics and access to resources, right? So we've been talking about this roundabout, and in some cases very explicit, that when you go to a school and the books are 20 years old, right, how prepared are you going to be for these standardized tests, which are not for folks of color, to then get into a college so that you can break the generational cycle of poverty, right? That sounds like something that's, I probably have a better chance of seeing molecules in the air with the glasses that I have on, right? And so that sounds like something that's very difficult to do. All at the same time, while we're shaming the trades, right? And so there's a lot of things that are going on in this complex formula. So when we think about systemic racism, we really, we're talking about, okay, Margot shared that, in that experience in high school, like the access to resources, right? I'm thinking about my experiences, if not for my mother, right, who is listening, and my dad, love you, mom and dad, she had to go to school to advocate, right? And we're a middle to lower class, right? And so if you don't have anybody to advocate, you're not getting access to those resources. So then that connects to the cycles, right? The cycles that we live in. It's very hard to jump from lower class to upper middle class and even higher class, right? Because that is the way that the system is set up, right? So it has a lot to do with economics. Who can afford to go pay for additional tutoring? folks who have good jobs. Well, who are those folk? Well, the folks who are, maybe some of their ancestors might have owned slaves, right? And so, and Jim, one thing I was thinking about, right, when you first posed the question, the first thing that came to my mind was the first commodity on the stock market was a slave, right? So we have the history here, right? Generations upon generations upon generations, where we see this now in the ag world, right? We have a labor force that's not even getting medical benefits, right? They're facing death, right? Death, right? And so these things are serious, right? And so I know that was a long answer, but when I think about economics and when I think about racism, they're very wedded together. They're not two mutually exclusive realms of existence. They're very wedded together, right? Because you need access, you need to have good food, right? So you can go to school and pay attention. That's just one example. So all these things come together. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Henderson. Professor Villegas, would you chime in on the connection between class and economic wealth and racism?
Absolutely. As my colleagues have just, explicitly stated, I think these systems of oppression, whether it's class or systemic racism, are very much intertwined with one another, right? Just as Dr. Henderson spoke about generations and generations of family and generations of poverty, we also have other families who have been able to build generations of wealth, right? These are the millionaires and billionaires that we see today that continue to perpetuate a system that disproportionately benefits them, that disproportionately benefits and exploits people of color, right? When we think about farm workers not having access to healthcare, when we think about farm workers being left out of policy, when we think about DACA recipients, when we think about undocumented folks, when we think about LGBTQ folks, when we think about communities that have been historically redlined, right? When I talk to my students about Chinatowns, a lot of folks are familiar with, oh yeah, I took a visit to Chinatown, right? But we don't acknowledge that Chinese communities were forced to self-segregate into their own communities because they were being faced with violence, because they weren't allowed to take jobs, because they weren't allowed to live in a society. They weren't allowed to take jobs, right? So when we look at all these industries in the Central Valley, whether it's agriculture or oil, people of color were historically excluded from many of these sectors. And today, unfortunately, they're facing the opposite of those benefits, right? They're facing things like environmental racism, in which pollution disproportionately impacts low-income people and people of color, right? And so class and structural racism are absolutely intertwined with one another. And it's one of the reasons that we can't fight racism with more racism, right? It's one of the reasons we can't fight capitalism with racial capitalism, right? It's not enough to throw a rainbow sticker or a Black Lives Matter sticker on, a product that you're selling and say, okay, we did it, we fixed structural racism, right? That's not the solution, right? In order to address systematic racism, in order to address a lot of these structural problems, we need to actually invest resources into programs, into people that are going to help fix and are going to help, alleviate these conditions.
Thank you. Margot, would you like to address the question?
No, I agree with everyone. I think it's so interconnected, class and that it makes it very difficult for people of color, because we often lack resources. We often lack direction. We have to work. We have to feed our families first before we can invest in things that for the future. It's a different mentality, and we have to consider that. The luxuries really aren't luxuries when you're talking about people who don't have enough. When you're talking about farm workers, they still are dealing with poor piping, poor housing, poor just primary needs. It's going to take a lot of work. And so I'm glad that we're able to talk about it, surface it. We will get a lot of pullback, especially within Tulare County, because it's painful. It's a painful past, and it's better to not address it and to keep the system the way it is, because it's been working for many. But I think that for the majority of us, who bring the food, who pick the fruit. It hasn't been. Healthcare situations, huge class difference. People who the haves and the have-nots, and so it's very, very sad. But I think it's something that we have to talk about. We have to confront. We have to be able to have these conversations in order for change to happen. And change is suffering. And so if people can build the tolerance to feel uncomfortable, to listen, to make small changes, I think it's going to benefit our generations to come. So.
Yeah, thank you. We're going to wrap this up with, I think, a great question from an audience member to wrap this discussion up. And it's a great note to end it. And the reader asks, what direct actions would the panel like to see to fight systemic racism in Tulare County? And I'll start with Dr. Lopez. So the reader asks, what direct actions would the panel like? What would you like to see as a first step to fight systemic racism in Tulare County?
Well, I would like to see us be able to rip down from St. Paul Church to go back up if we really want to talk about and start to really respond. I think that we need to be able for people to be able to actually visibly, and I would like to see us put those posters back up and find a home for them, and for us to not feel so threatened by conversations and people wanting to have open conversations in the community about these things. So, and having explicit conversations about what it means to be anti-racist. Me and my colleagues are a collective, and that's yet a whole other conversation, right? So there's one thing about talking and deconstructing and breaking down systemic racism and having an understanding of it. It's a whole entirely different thing when we want to begin actually talking about what it means to be anti-racist. And
right. Now, Dr. Lopez, you mentioned that Dr. Lopez, you mentioned that you wanted to quickly address a comment that you saw coming in Facebook, and I wanted to give you that chance right here to quickly address that comment.
Oh yeah, and it was just a really comment that I noticed earlier, that there was a comment in response to my reference to racialized capitalism, and racialized capitalism is not yet another form of capitalism. Where people of color are the beneficiaries of capitalism. It's in the interrelation and racialized communities, and how that economic system is a complete detriment to the well-being of the community. So it's not this social justice approach to capitalism. I noticed that, and I just wanted to clarify because it's a very important detail, and I don't want anyone to leave here thinking that I am, advocating for people of color capitalist uprising at all, because I am not. Thank you so much, Jim, for letting me say that.
Thank you. Dr. Henderson, why don't you address the question? If you need me to repeat it, I can go ahead. And you are muted, Dr. Henderson, so unmute yourself.
I said, I got it, Jim. I think I'll repeat it back to you just to make sure. Just some actionable steps about what we can do moving forward.
Exactly.
So I think that what we've talked about here is a process. So I think the first thing is to realize that it's not a magic pill that one can take and poof, systematic racism is gone. On the other hand, I think there has to be an immense amount of ownership, right? And so the folks in power, I think there has to be an immense amount of ownership regarding their role in the system, right? So you have to own what's going on and your role in the system. So just because somebody says that they support Black Lives Matter, it doesn't mean that they're anti the police or They don't like folks who are not Black, so forth and so on. That is more indicative of stuff that may be going on inside of you versus, you know, the movement for equity, the movement to have voices heard. So when folks are having these reactions to even having the discussion, right? We can pull the chat for this event right now and publish a study, just given some of the things that are being said regarding just having a discussion on racism, right? So how can we have true healing without even having a discussion where folks have to be held accountable? And Jim, I'll end with this. Malcolm X has a quote, right? When he talked about the knife in his back. But I'll say that quote was already shared. He has another quote. He says, once you cross the Canadian border, you are in the South, right? And what that means is that racism is ever present in all of America, right? And to really achieve true healing, radical healing, holistic healing, we have to first speak to the pain, right? So the folks who have benefited, you know, white privilege, if we can't speak to the pain, healing will never take place, and these systems will continue to exist.
Thank you, Dr. Henderson. Professor Villegas, why don't you talk about concrete steps people can take to help end systemic racism in Tulare County today?
One of the most important things I think people can do is to educate themselves about systematic racism and about their own implicit biases. Right, a few weeks ago, I was talking to my colleagues Juan Arzola and Octavio Barajas at College of the Sequoias, and we're talking about how it's not enough to be not racist. A lot of folks, when you start talking about racism, they'll say, "Well, I'm not racist," and that's great, but it's not enough, right? It's not enough to be not racist. You have to be explicitly anti-racist. And I'm so glad Dr. Lopez brought this up, because we need to be asking ourselves if we as individuals are actively challenging racism, right? Whether that's in the workforce, in our jobs, our educational spaces, at home, at family gatherings, right? If you are not actively taking steps to combat racism within our community, then you're just perpetuating the status quo, right? And that's something folks have to realize at home watching, right? Is what are we doing to specifically advocate for and to remedy the systemic oppression that has occurred to communities of color in Tulare County and the Central Valley and within our entire country? And in addition to that, one of the ways we can help with that, right, is explicitly educating our young folks, right? I'm talking about in our high school districts, in our middle schools. Are you advocating for more inclusive studies and ethnic studies specifically within our school districts? And I think that's one of the greatest steps that parents, students, and viewers at home can take in order to help address systematic racism, specifically within Tulare County. Thank you.
Thank you. Margot, would you like to chime in, the last person here tonight?
Okay, I'll quickly say that I think we need to make attempts to articulate, to talk about your experiences, dare to listen, dare to hear others, so that we can share in a collective conversation with joy and passion. When our truth is heard, greater consciousness occurs. And I think that we can start with us. If we can dare to listen, even for the people who don't want to hear it, if we can dare to listen to others who want to share, then we can start to make some change. We have to be curious, because when we're not curious, we're engaging in active ignorance. And so I think that is at the root of the systemic racism. So I'll just leave you with those thoughts.
Well, thank you. I think, Dr. Henderson, why don't you wrap it up with your final thought?
To everybody in the chat, I just want to say I love you. I can feel the love coming out. And when we have topics that are sensitive to folks, everybody's not going to be on the same page, right? And to those folks who are not on the same page today, we love you too. Thank you for the opportunity, and we're looking forward to being part of future discussions.
Well, thank you, Dr. Henderson, and thank you for everyone who tuned in tonight, and thank you for the panelists who agreed to take time out of their evening to talk about this important issue. Tulare County Voices will continue the conversation about systemic racism for the next a few months. Next month, March, we will be talking about systemic racism in healthcare, which obviously with the pandemic going on is a critically important question that we need to address. So log in next month at the end of the month for our forum on systemic racism and healthcare. And for the panelists, again, I thank you very much for taking part tonight. And for the audience members, thank you for logging in, and good night.
Good night.
Thanks for the opportunity, Jim.
Thank you.